What if I told you that a single word could change a child's entire future? What if that word came from a complete stranger who witnessed something so heartbreaking that it compelled them to act? Today, I'm going to share with you a story that will challenge everything you think you know about kindness, privilege, and the power of human intervention. But before we dive in, let me ask you this: when was the last time you saw something wrong happening and actually did something about it? Not just thought about it, not just felt bad about it, but actually took action. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a masterclass in how one moment of courage can ripple through generations. The year was 2019, and the place was a small diner in rural Oklahoma, the kind of establishment where the coffee is always hot, the pie is homemade, and everybody knows everybody else's business. It was a Tuesday afternoon, that dead zone between lunch and dinner when most restaurants are quiet except for the occasional trucker or local regular nursing a cup of coffee. Sarah Martinez had been working double shifts at Murphy's Diner for 3 months straight. At 24, she was a single mother trying to make ends meet after her husband walked out when their daughter Emma was just 2 years old. The tips were decent enough, but with rent, daycare, and medical bills piling up, decent wasn't cutting it anymore. That particular afternoon, Sarah had no choice but to bring 5-year-old Emma to work with her. The daycare had called in sick, her usual babysitter was unavailable, and missing another shift would mean losing her job entirely. So there Emma sat in booth number 7, a tiny figure with dark curls falling over her coloring book, trying her best to be invisible while her mother rushed between tables. Emma understood, even at 5, that mommy was stressed. She could see it in the way Sarah's shoulders tensed when the register wouldn't open properly, hear it in the slightly sharper tone when she spoke to the cook about order mistakes. Emma had learned to read these signs the way other children learn to read picture books, out of necessity, out of survival. The afternoon crowd was typical: a few construction workers grabbing late lunch, an elderly couple sharing a piece of apple pie, and a businessman in an expensive suit who sat alone near the window, occasionally glancing up from his laptop. This man, whose name was David Chen, had stopped at Murphy's Diner by pure chance. His Tesla had alerted him that he needed to charge, and the diner happened to be next to one of the few charging stations in this rural stretch of highway. David Chen wasn't your typical diner customer. At 42, he was worth approximately $12 million, earned through a series of successful tech startups and savvy real estate investments. He was known in Silicon Valley circles as a shrewd negotiator and brilliant strategist. But what most people didn't know about David was that he'd grown up in circumstances remarkably similar to Emma's, raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. As David typed away on his laptop, preparing for a conference call with investors in Shanghai, he couldn't help but notice the little girl in booth 7. There was something about her careful stillness, the way she kept glancing up at her mother with worried eyes, that transported him back to his own childhood. He remembered countless afternoons spent in his mother's workplace, sometimes a laundromat, sometimes a grocery store, always with the same instruction: be good, stay quiet, don't cause any trouble. By 4 o'clock, the diner had gotten busier. The after-school crowd was starting to filter in, teenagers wanting sodas and fries, parents picking up coffee before heading home. Sarah was juggling 6 tables by herself because the other waitress had called in sick, and the pressure was mounting. Emma, who had been an angel for nearly 3 hours, was starting to get restless. She was hungry, tired, and desperately needed to use the bathroom, but she could see how busy her mother was. Every time Sarah passed booth 7, Emma would start to raise her hand to get attention, but then she'd see the frazzled expression on her mother's face and lower it again. Finally, Emma's 5-year-old bladder couldn't wait any longer. She slipped out of the booth and walked over to where Sarah was taking an order from a table of 4 truckers. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging gently on Sarah's apron, "I need to go potty." "Not now, Emma," Sarah said without looking down, her voice strained as she tried to remember whether the customer wanted his burger medium or medium well. Emma waited patiently, shifting from foot to foot. When Sarah finished taking the order, Emma tried again. "Mommy, I really need to." "Emma," I said, "not now." Sarah's voice was sharper this time, loud enough that several customers looked over. The stress of the day, the mounting bills, the exhaustion of working double shifts, it all came crashing down in that moment. Emma's lower lip began to tremble. She hadn't meant to cause trouble. She'd tried so hard to be good, to be invisible, to not need anything. But she was just a little girl, and little girls sometimes need their mommies, even when their mommies are overwhelmed. The tears started silently, just small drops rolling down her cheeks. But to Sarah, those tears represented everything that was going wrong in her life. Here she was, trying to earn money to provide for her daughter, and Emma was making a scene in front of customers, without thinking, driven by exhaustion and frustration and the crushing weight of single parenthood. Sarah raised her hand and slapped Emma across the face. The sound echoed through the suddenly quiet diner like a gunshot. "I told you not to bother me," Sarah shouted, her own eyes filling with tears of shame even as the words left her mouth. "Can't you see I'm working? Can't you see I'm trying to take care of you?" Emma stood frozen, her small hand pressed to her reddening cheek, too shocked to even cry. The entire diner had gone silent. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the cook in the back seemed to have stopped moving. David Chen had been reaching for his coffee cup when the slap occurred. His hand froze in midair, and something deep inside his chest tightened like a fist. He'd been that little girl once, not literally, but emotionally. He'd been the child whose parent was so overwhelmed by life that love sometimes got expressed through frustration and exhaustion, but David had also learned something that Sarah hadn't yet discovered: there were always other options. Always. That he stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame unfolding from the booth like a gentle giant. Every eye in the diner tracked his movement as he walked across the checkered linoleum floor toward booth 7. His expensive Italian leather shoes made soft sounds against the worn flooring, a whispered rhythm that seemed to count down to something significant. Sarah noticed him approaching and immediately went into damage control mode. "I'm so sorry," she began, her voice shaking. "She's usually very well behaved. This won't happen again, I promise. Please don't complain to my manager." David stopped directly in front of Emma, who was still standing frozen with her hand pressed to her cheek. He crouched down slowly until he was at her eye level, this powerful businessman in his $1,000 suit kneeling on the floor of a small-town diner. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Emma stared back with wide, frightened eyes, unsure what this strange man wanted from her. David could see himself in those eyes, the confusion, the hurt, the desperate desire to be good enough, to be worthy of love without conditions. When David finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that people in the nearby booths had to strain to hear him. But that single word carried more weight than a shouted speech, more power than any lecture or threat or demand. Enough. That was it. Just one word. But the way he said it, with such absolute conviction, such unshakable authority, made it clear that he wasn't asking or suggesting. He was declaring an end to something. An end to this child's suffering, to this cycle of overwhelm and frustration, to this moment of despair. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but David held up one finger without looking away from Emma. Still crouched at the little girl's level, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. But instead of making a call or sending a text, he did something completely unexpected. He opened his photo gallery and showed Emma a picture, a faded color photograph of a young Asian boy, maybe 6 years old, standing next to a woman in a work uniform. The boy looked serious beyond his years, and there was a sadness in his eyes that mirrored what Emma was feeling right now. "That's me," David said softly, "and that's my mama. She worked 3 jobs to take care of me, and sometimes she got so tired that she forgot how to be gentle. But that doesn't mean it was okay. And it doesn't mean you deserved what just happened." Emma's eyes widened. This man understood. This stranger in his fancy clothes and expensive watch, he had been where she was right now. David stood up slowly and finally turned to face Sarah. She was crying now, her hands shaking as she gripped her order pad. She expected him to yell at her, to call child services, to have her fired. She expected judgment and condemnation and all the things she was already heaping on herself. Instead, David did something that nobody in that diner would ever forget. That he sat down in booth 7 and gestured for both Sarah and Emma to join him. Then he did something even more unexpected. He ordered 3 pieces of pie and asked Sarah to take a break. I can't, Sarah protested. I'm working. I have tables to serve. I just bought out every table in this diner, David said calmly, pulling out his phone and speaking briefly to someone on the other end. Within minutes, a woman in professional attire walked through the front door, David's assistant, who had been waiting in the car. Margaret will handle the tables, David said. Right now, we need to talk. For the next hour, as Emma colored quietly beside them and occasionally stole bites of chocolate cream pie, David and Sarah talked. Not businessman to waitress, not rich man to poor woman, but human being to human being. Sarah told him about the mounting bills, about the ex-husband who never sent child support, about the constant fear of losing her job or not being able to afford Emma's medical insurance. She talked about the guilt of bringing Emma to work, about feeling like she was failing as a mother, about the bone-deep exhaustion that made her feel like she was drowning. David listened without judgment, nodding at the parts that resonated with his own childhood memories. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for a long moment. My mother used to bring me to her jobs too, he said finally. I remember thinking that if I could just be good enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, maybe she wouldn't be so tired all the time. Maybe she would smile more. Maybe she wouldn't look at me like I was another burden to carry. Sarah's breath caught. That was exactly how she'd been feeling, like Emma was just one more impossible demand on her already impossible life. But here's what I learned, David continued, and what took me years of therapy to understand: your exhaustion isn't Emma's fault. Your struggles aren't Emma's burden to carry. And the cycle doesn't have to continue. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a business card, not his own, but for a local daycare center. I made a phone call while we were talking. Emma has a full scholarship to attend Little Scholars Academy starting Monday. Transportation included. Sarah stared at the card like it was written in a foreign language. I don't understand. How much does this cost? I can't afford, it's handled, David said simply. The scholarship covers everything through 8th grade, with an option to extend through high school if needed. Emma will get breakfast and lunch, after-school care, tutoring if necessary, and summer programs. But David wasn't finished. He slid another piece of paper across the table, a job offer from his company's customer service division. This is a remote position. 40 hours a week, full benefits, starting salary $52,000 a year. You can work from home, set your own hours around Emma's schedule, and there's room for advancement. Sarah was shaking now, but not from exhaustion or fear. She was shaking because she couldn't believe what was happening. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this for strangers? David looked down at Emma, who had stopped coloring and was listening with the intense concentration that children reserve for moments when they sense something important is happening. Because 37 years ago, I was sitting exactly where Emma is sitting now. And nobody intervened. Nobody said, enough. My mother and I struggled for years longer than we needed to because we didn't know there were other options. He paused, his voice becoming even quieter. And because that little boy grew up to become someone who could say, enough, and actually do something about it. 6 months later, David received a handwritten letter in the mail. The envelope was addressed in careful, childish writing, with several crossed-out attempts at spelling his last name correctly. Inside were 2 things, a drawing of 3 people standing in front of a house, labeled Emma, Mommy, and Mr. David, and a note in Sarah's handwriting. The note told him about Emma's progress at Little Scholars Academy, how she'd made friends, how her reading level had jumped 2 grades, how she discovered a love for science. It told him about Sarah's success in her new job, about the small apartment they'd been able to rent, about the way their relationship had transformed once the constant stress of survival had been lifted. But the part that made David's eyes water was the final paragraph. Emma asks about you every day. She says you're her guardian angel. But what she doesn't know yet is that you didn't just save us that day, you taught us how to save ourselves. We've started volunteering at the local women's shelter, and Sarah is studying to become a counselor so she can help other single mothers navigate the system. We want to be someone else's enough moment. The drawing now hangs in David's office, right next to his business degrees and achievement awards. When people ask about it, he tells them Emma's story. And without exception, every person who hears that story starts looking for their own enough moments, situations where a single word, a single action, a single choice to intervene can change the trajectory of someone's life. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a child psychologist at Stanford, studies what she calls intervention moments, those critical points when external help can break cycles of stress, abuse, or neglect. Research shows that it often takes just one person believing in a family's potential to create lasting change, she explains. When someone steps in with practical solutions rather than judgment, the success rate for families in crisis increases by over 70%. The statistics are sobering. In the United States, approximately 2.9 million children experience some form of neglect or abuse each year, often from parents who are overwhelmed rather than malicious. Studies indicate that 68% of these situations could be prevented or resolved through community intervention and support rather than punishment. But Emma and Sarah's story isn't just about statistics, it's about the ripple effect that occurs when one person decides to act. David's assistant, Margaret, was so moved by what she witnessed that day that she started a nonprofit organization focused on providing emergency childcare for working parents. The diner owner, inspired by David's example, created a safe space program where struggling parents could bring their children during difficult times. Even the other customers in the diner that day were affected. One of the truckers, a man named Frank Rodriguez, started carrying gift cards to restaurants and gas stations in his cab, handing them out to families he encountered who seemed to be struggling. "I kept thinking about that little girl's face," he said later. "I kept wondering how many other kids I'd seen over the years who needed someone to say, enough, but nobody did." What makes Emma and Sarah's story so powerful isn't just the happy ending, it's the recognition that Sarah wasn't a bad mother. She was an overwhelmed human being caught in a cycle that millions of families experience every day. The moment she slapped Emma wasn't born from cruelty but from desperation, exhaustion, and the crushing weight of trying to survive in a system that offers little support for struggling parents. David understood this because he'd lived it. His mother, Lin Chen, had immigrated to the United States from Taiwan with nothing but hope and determination. She'd worked as a seamstress in a factory, cleaned office buildings at night, and sold homemade dumplings on weekends, anything to keep her son fed and housed. The stress had sometimes overwhelmed her capacity for patience, leading to moments she later regretted. "The difference between me and Emma," David reflected in a later interview, "is that I had to wait 37 years to break the cycle. Emma gets to start fresh at age 5. This distinction is crucial." Research from the Center for Family Development shows that early intervention, particularly when it addresses both immediate needs and long-term stability, can completely alter a child's developmental trajectory. Children who receive comprehensive support before age 7 show dramatic improvements in academic performance, social skills, and emotional regulation compared to those who receive help later in life. But the story also highlights something else: the importance of recognizing overwhelmed parents as human beings worthy of compassion rather than judgment. Sarah's response to stress wasn't acceptable, but it was understandable. And understanding it was the first step toward changing it. When we approach struggling families with solutions rather than shame, explains Dr. Maria Santos, director of the National Child Welfare Institute, we see remarkable transformations. Parents who felt hopeless begin to see possibilities. Children who were absorbing stress begin to thrive. The entire family dynamic shifts from survival mode to growth mode. Today, Emma is 8 years old and in 3rd grade. She's an honor student who wants to be a scientist when she grows up, specifically because she wants to discover things that help people like Mr. David helped us. She still draws pictures for David, sending them to his office with updates about her science projects and her new baby sister. Sarah remarried 2 years ago to a man she met in her counseling program. Sarah now works as a family advocate, helping other single mothers navigate the complex web of social services, childcare options, and employment resources. She's discovered that her experience with overwhelm and near desperation has given her a unique ability to connect with families in crisis. "I don't judge them," she says, "because I've been exactly where they are. David has expanded his intervention efforts, creating what he calls the Enough Foundation, a non-profit that provides emergency support to families in crisis. The foundation operates on the principle that most family dysfunction stems from system failures rather than personal failures, and that addressing practical needs often resolves what appear to be behavioral problems. The foundation has helped over 3,000 families in the past 3 years, with a success rate that has caught the attention of child welfare agencies across the country. The model is simple: provide immediate practical support, childcare, job assistance, housing help, while connecting families with long-term resources and support systems. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of Emma's story is how it's inspired others to look for their own enough moments. David regularly receives messages from people who've heard Emma's story and decided to intervene in situations they might previously have ignored. A teacher in Ohio noticed a student who seemed hungry and tired, and instead of just reporting it, she connected the family with local resources and even arranged for the child to have weekend meals. A neighbor in Texas saw a young mother struggling with a screaming baby and overwhelming groceries, and instead of walking past, she offered to help, which led to a friendship that provided the emotional support the mother desperately needed. These aren't grand gestures or million-dollar interventions. They're human beings deciding to pay attention, to care, and to act when they see someone who needs help. The truth is, you don't need to be a millionaire to change someone's life. You don't need vast resources or special skills. You just need to be willing to see suffering and say, enough, and then follow that declaration with action, however small. Maybe your enough moment is noticing a coworker who seems overwhelmed and offering to help with their workload. Maybe it's seeing a parent losing patience with their child in a grocery store and offering a kind word instead of judgment. Maybe it's recognizing that the homeless person you pass every day is a human being who deserves dignity and respect. The power isn't in the size of your bank account or the extent of your influence. The power is in the willingness to interrupt cycles of suffering with moments of unexpected kindness. Emma's story began with a slap and a word. It could have ended there, with just another moment of overwhelm in a difficult life. Instead, it became a testimony to the transformative power of human intervention, proof that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to look away. So I'll leave you with the same question I asked at the beginning: when was the last time you saw something wrong happening and actually did something about it? Because somewhere out there, right now, there's a little girl or boy who needs someone to walk across a diner floor and say, enough. There's a parent who's overwhelmed and needs someone to offer solutions instead of judgment. There's a family caught in a cycle that could be broken with one moment of compassionate intervention. The question isn't whether you have the power to change someone's life. The question is whether you're willing to use it. What will your enough moment be? If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power we all have to intervene in moments of crisis, then hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of our capacity to change each other's lives, one moment of courage at a time. And let me know in the comments, have you ever experienced an enough moment, either as someone who intervened or someone who received help? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today, because in the end, we're all just walking through diners, looking for opportunities to be someone else's guardian angel. The question is, will we have the courage to say enough when the moment comes?